Welcome back. In this video, I want to run through a brief simulation for pre-writing a literary analysis essay using the novel The Great Gatsby by Scott Fitzgerald as a base. This video will assume some familiarity with the novel The Great Gatsby. If you're not familiar with it, that's okay. Mainly, we'll be focusing on the application of some of the strategies we've gone over towards the implementation of literary analysis. So before we start, let's review some of the important concepts or steps we need to keep in mind as we're applying these strategies. The first is the iceberg theory or iceberg method. So as we discussed before, we're going to be thinking of the literary text that we'll be analyzing, in this case, a novel, as if it's an iceberg. There is a top portion of the iceberg that is visible, but this top portion only accounts for a relatively small percentage of what the actual iceberg is. And there is a much larger percentage underneath that accounts for a large proportion of the meaning. So in this case, if we're looking at a novel, this top part is going to account for characters, plot, settings, and conflict. This portion that is underneath the surface that we cannot see is called the subtext. And here we'll be thinking about the theme. So if we are analyzing The Great Gatsby, the question is, what are some of the underlying implicit messages, that Scott Fitzgerald is trying to convey through his novel? And so our goal is to analyze this part, break down this surface level, so that we can get under the surface, literally read between the lines to access the subtext of the novel. To start applying this strategy, we're going to basically use the who, what, where, when, why, and how questions to help us sort of isolate the elements of the novel that we can see, these being the surface level components. And then we're going to think of these as puzzle pieces that we can use to start piecing together what the theme of the novel may be, or what a possible theme may be. Keep in mind that novels, short stories, etc., have always multiple themes unless they are especially simplistic. Just because you arrive at one theme in your analysis does not mean that that theme is all encompassing or that it is the definitive theme. Be careful also to take into consideration that even authors themselves do not necessarily have the whole vision of a novel. There is a concept in literary analysis called death of the author, and this refers to the validity of all interpretations being equal. I personally do put a lot of stock into an author's intent with a novel, but sometimes themes are unintentional and indirect, and the author may not even mean for those themes to manifest. So keep in mind that interpretations are valid if there is sufficient evidence to support them within the text. Okay, so to start an analysis of something like The Great Gatsby, we want to isolate, again, the surface level components from those that are subtextual. So again, we want to think about who are the characters in the novel. We want to think about what happens in the novel. We want to think about where and when the story takes place. This accounts for our surface level. And then we want to think about how the story is told. And then we want to think about why the story is told. So the why would be our theme. The how would be things like our style and our figurative language. And then the who, what, where, and when would be our surface level components that we can see just by reading the book. So in The Great Gatsby, we have several main characters. We have obviously Gatsby himself. We have Nick, who is the narrator. We have Nick's cousin Daisy and the object of Gatsby's affections. And then we also have Tom, who is Daisy's husband and essentially the antagonist of the work. Another major character would be Jordan Baker, And we have some other characters here, such as Myrtle, Tom's mistress, but we'll consider those to be of lesser importance than these main four. The what would be the plot. And so we understand that Gatsby uses bootlegging essentially to become rich and attract Daisy. However, once he's exposed, there is a chain of events that leads to his death. And also the disillusionment of Nick, the narrator. Where and when does the story take place? It takes place in New York in the Roaring 20s. So we have 1920s New York. Those familiar with F. Scott Fitzgerald's life and his recurring themes in his work will know that Fitzgerald, of course, he and Zelda, his wife, were very affluent and very much a part of the 1920s kind of party scene. Zelda has famously been called the first flapper. And so Fitzgerald was very familiar with the type of lifestyle that he is depicting in this novel and in the rest of his books. It's important to keep in mind this context because it informs what the theme might be. So remember that context is very important. We want to always keep in mind that the author, and in this case Fitzgerald, were aware of what they were trying to say with their stories, and that type of a life experience bleeds into the novel itself and can inform the direction or attitude towards the themes. Some notable things about the figurative language would include things like Nick's POV. So it's important that we don't actually get the perspective of Gatsby in the novel, at least not in terms of the first person perspective. Nick is essentially the major character throughout the book. So this lends a question as to why would a character like Nick, who is an outsider, be given the perspective? Perhaps Nick is meant to act as author proxy. He's sort of like an outsider looking in. He gets to see how the effects of this very affluent, rich lifestyle degrade people like Gatsby, Daisy, and Tom. We also get different symbols throughout the novel. One of the most famous symbols would be the green light that Gatsby watches from his side of the pier. And the green light again represents Daisy, represents the American dream, etc. And then that leaves the question of why. Why did Fitzgerald write this book? What is he trying to portray through these events? So once you have isolated these major surface level components, the who being the characters, the what being the plot, the where and when being the setting, both physical and temporal, and then the how being the style and figurative language used to construct the story, you can start identifying components that you think convey part of the plot. So if I were writing a literary analysis of The Great Gatsby, I would obviously want to focus on characters like Gatsby himself. I may want to focus on characters like Nick. I may want to focus on Daisy and Tom. So let's say, for example, that I want to focus on Gatsby and Daisy as possible portions of my analysis. I definitely want to look at the plot. The plot is very telling in this case. Gatsby is a bootlegger. So during the Prohibition era, he sells alcohol illegally and makes money this way. And he does this under the false assumption that Daisy will fall in love with him, because he believes that to be attracted to Daisy, he must offer her a lifestyle that she has grown accustomed to with Tom. He must be the consummate rich person, essentially. He must exude wealth, even puts on airs of superiority. But what we find out later is that Gatsby is fake. He is not actually of that high class to which Daisy and Tom belong. He is lower class. He has gained his wealth illegally, and he is putting himself off as someone who he really is not. This leads to his death. So part of the story could be read as a fable or parable, that in the interest of pursuing a dream, Gatsby has denied his reality and taken on a lie, and that falsehood has essentially led to his death. The where and when would be the 1920s New York setting. So this is definitely very important to any analysis of The Great Gatsby. As we know, the Roaring 20s, as they were called, led to, in some respects, the 1930s Great Depression. So the crash of the stock market in 1929 prefaced essentially the Great Depression. And to some degree, we can think of the Roaring Twenties as this kind of very idealistic, reckless era of spending where many Americans didn't conceive of the bubble bursting. Fitzgerald famously is part of this. The height of his career occurred during the 1920s, and it was only afterwards when he started facing financial difficulties, especially as his wife Zelda suffered increasingly more intense bouts with mental illness to such a degree that she was eventually interred in a sanitarium. In fact, was in and out of different sanitariums, and Fitzgerald had to turn to writing scripts for Hollywood to make ends meet. And so what we have here is a kind of pinnacle. We have a peak of brilliance for Fitzgerald and really the world in which he inhabited, and then we have a fall from grace. So it's almost as though Gatsby represents to some degree the rise of Fitzgerald and his collective society's wealth, their affluence, their idealism, and then his death represents a kind of inevitable fall from this peak, that the type of lifestyle and wealth that Fitzgerald generation was buoying or celebrating was unsustainable. And so that is a possible theme in The Great Gatsby, the insustainability of wealth. We could also have something like the inaccessibility of dreams versus reality. Gatsby orients his life around a fantasy and does not really concern himself with reality. And so he turns away from actual dangers that threaten his life. We can also look at the character of Nick being the outsider looking in, who at first is enthralled by the lifestyle of his New York family and friends, and then at the end of the novel comes to realize that it was all kind of built on nothing. It dissipates, as is a common theme in Fitzgerald's writing. So these are all possible whys. And as you can see, it's by looking at the surface level components and asking why that we can start to answer some of these questions. Why is Gatsby the character that he is? Why is Daisy the character that she is? Why is Nick the character that he is, excuse me? Why does Gatsby's story end tragically in death? Why does, before that, Gatsby lose Daisy? Why does Daisy stay with Tom? Why is the story set in the 1920s? Why is it set in New York? Why does it deal with issues of success and wealth and money that is ill-gotten? Why is it Nick's perspective that dominates the story as opposed to Gatsby, who is the titular character? What is the significance of the green light that enraptures Gatsby every night and that motivates him to host all of these luscious parties? All of this, all these different questions, by asking the question of why, we can actually start to piece together what a possible theme is to The Great Gatsby. Now, again, whatever themes that we infer are not all-encompassing necessarily. They are not definitive in the sense that they exhaust all of the analytical possibilities of The Great Gatsby. But from a starting place, they give us a space in which we can start to piece together some of the possible meanings and messages that Fitzgerald intended and maybe didn't intend with his novel. So we can think of this as our pre-writing. Once we have pre-written, we now want to start putting together an outline so that we can actually draft our essay. Of course, in a more rigorous essay, I would also want to gather sources. So I would look for primary sources related to Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald wrote many essays and letters that we could use as primary documents to inform his process of writing, both in regards to The Great Gatsby as well as other of his novels, such as This Side of Paradise and Tender is the Night, which, even though they're different novels, can still give us insight into Fitzgerald's writing process and his thinking. We can also look at documents from Fitzgerald's contemporaries. So Fitzgerald was a friend with Hemingway, that being Ernest Hemingway, author of For Whom the Bell Tolls and Old Man and the Sea, Farewell to Arms, etc. So we can get primary documents from contemporaries such as Hemingway and Zelda Fitzgerald, Scott's wife. We can also refer to secondary documents, secondary sources. In this case, other analyses or reviews of Fitzgerald's literary texts. We can even get historical, or rather informative sources about history as they pertain to the 1920s and the Roaring Twenties and the type of historical factors that were affecting people like Fitzgerald, such as World War I and the Lost Generation. So we can get informative historical sources. By this, I don't mean literally historical, but sources that are meant to give us information about that time period, as well as perhaps even Fitzgerald's life. So understanding that Fitzgerald himself was not born into wealth, and that he actually gained wealth through his writing, can also help us understand the appeal and allure of wealth as it affects characters like Gatsby and Nick. It's also important to understand that Zelda, for example, was a socialite who refused to marry Fitzgerald until he could establish himself financially. And so Daisy, in some respects, reflects the type of character that Zelda was to Fitzgerald in his early life. The sort of alluring, not necessarily a temptress, but a goal or a prize that he sought, and money was the means to which he could achieve that. So once we've established our pre-writing and also gotten sufficiently the sources that we want, we can start outlining our literary analysis. Let me just erase the rest of this. And again, what we are focusing on here is less a comprehensive analysis of Gatsby and more of a simulation of how we would approach the writing process to start a novel like this. So the strategies that we are demonstrating here can be used with regard to any literary text that we are hoping to analyze by any author. The scope of the essay might require you to incorporate more sources or to flesh out your ideas in more detail. But generally speaking, a beginner level literary analysis would be approached in this way. When we structure and outline our essay, we again always want to use the IBC structure. So we have an introduction, body, and conclusion. Obviously, in the intro, we want to introduce Fitzgerald and his novel, in this case, The Great Gatsby. When we are introducing Fitzgerald, it's very important that we keep in mind that we only include relevant, pertinent details about his background and his historical context. If we include an entire biography of Fitzgerald and we don't actually address the majority of his life events in our analysis, the reader is going to be scratching the head and wondering why so much background information is included. So very critical that you remember that whatever information you include in your introduction will actually be relevant later on in the essay, and it will actually be commented on. So only ever include information in the intro that you intend to comment on in the body of the essay. To this degree, we also may want to summarize to some extent The Great Gatsby. Again, we don't want to summarize the entire novel and all of its characters. We only provide a summary to the degree that it's necessary to understand the analysis. So we provide enough details to our reader who is mostly unfamiliar with the novel can still read our essay and understand our point. We also want to incorporate a thesis statement. The thesis, of course, is our argumentative claim, as it were, our analytical claim about The Great Gatsby. And we can put something like that Gatsby's death is a cautionary tale for living dishonestly. Again, this is not exhaustive by any means. It is not meant to represent the totality of Fitzgerald's Gatsby, but it is a possible theme that one can take away. And I think for a beginner student in a literary analysis course, learning these skills, it's more than sufficient. So that would be our introduction. So now let's make some room for our body. So what would we focus on? So our body, which would be our evidence, the things that we are going to use to support our thesis statement. So this, Gatsby's death being a cautionary tale for dishonest life, that is going to be our argument throughout the novel, or rather our essay. We need to prove that this theme is actually relevant and true as it pertains to the book. This means finding evidence, both within the primary text of the novel, the primary documents of Fitzgerald's writing and correspondence with his contemporaries, the writings of his contemporaries, as well as secondary articles, reviews, and analyses related to Fitzgerald to prove this. So we think of everything that we compiled previously as our trove of evidence, and we need to start deciding what we want to use to support our point here. So how are we going to establish that Gatsby's death is a parable, or a cautionary tale rather, for living a dishonest life? So from the novel itself, I may want to include things like an analysis of Gatsby's character versus perhaps Tom or Nick. So even though Tom is a villain in the story, why doesn't Tom die? Why doesn't Tom receive the comeuppance that the reader tends to think he deserves? Why is Gatsby the one who ends up dying? Is there some degree of difference between Gatsby and Tom, between Gatsby and Nick, that leads one to die and the other to survive by the end of the book? So that's very critical to keep in mind. What is Fitzgerald's intent with keeping some of these characters alive versus others? Let's think about something we could then include in the second part, which would be the setting of the book, this being 1920s New York. So if we incorporate and combine our understanding of the setting with secondary sources related to that era of time in American history, we can start to support a reading of The Great Gatsby as being a critique, perhaps, of the Roaring '20s and the type of lifestyle that many people enjoyed. We know that it's unsustainable. And so the type of wealth, the type of glitz and glamour that Gatsby perpetuated in the pursuit of his own personal happiness, selfishly, while at the same time committing crimes to support his wealth, ultimately led to his death. So Gatsby lived a superficial life. And so we can support this type of reading by looking at critiques of the setting, by looking at the type of setting and the type of behavior promoted, and also considering sources that help support us, that believe in the same type of idea, or that align themselves with our general purpose when it comes to Gatsby and Fitzgerald's attitude towards him. We also may want to look at the symbolism. So the green light, for example, could be our third point that we focus on. This could be a analysis of something that's out of reach. So Gatsby, what he's seeking is always going to be out of reach. It is very attractive, and yet at the end it's dangerous. And so by transgressing, pushing past the bounds of his safe life, let's think, the limits of safety in his life, Gatsby reached too far. He was almost like a early 20th century Icarus, right? Reaching beyond what he could safely attain. He got it briefly, but he ended up burning out as a result of pushing past his social class, acquiring wealth through dubious means, and ultimately paying a price for living superficially. So think of this as our paragraph 1, paragraph 2, and paragraph 3. We have a paragraph about the characters. We have a paragraph about the setting of the novel, that being 1920s New York, and we have a paragraph about the symbolism, that being the green light in the story. Again, there are many symbols in The Great Gatsby. There are many different settings. There are many different characters. So this is not meant to be a prescriptive set of topics that you would use in your body paragraphs for a literary analysis of the novel, simply to demonstrate that these are how we would isolate elements from our analysis previously, from our pre-writing, and we would slot them into the sections of the body. It's also possible that we might take more than one paragraph to focus on characters like Gatsby and Tom. We might take more than one paragraph to focus on a discussion of the setting, and we might take more than one paragraph to focus on a discussion of the novel symbols. Whatever we decide, and the writer, again, has to use his or her discretion here, the idea is that we are organizing our essay in a way that introduces the novel, introduces the relevant elements that we're going to be discussing in the body, and that the evidences that we choose from the body are not arbitrary, but come together. They work in concert to promote our argumentative claim or analytical claim, which is that Gatsby's death is a cautionary tale for living dishonestly. So we need to make sure that our discussion for each of these elements, all of these three components, come together to argue the same thing. Each of these in isolation might be an interesting point of analysis, but they need to work together. If our literary analysis focuses on Gatsby versus Tom and Nick and does not create a link between those ideas and the setting, does not create a link between those two ideas and the green light as a symbol, then we failed in writing a comprehensive, cohesive analysis. What we've done instead is isolated different things, analyze them in isolation, but not really put them together or linked them in any sort of compelling, argumentative, persuasive way. So just keep in mind that when you're writing an analysis, the various elements of the surface text that you analyze need to link together. There needs to be cohesion. They need to be telling the same type of idea. So they are each individual. They are subordinate to your thesis statement. All right, going to remove these from the body so that we can discuss the conclusion. Obviously, in the conclusion, we have less of a burden to make, or rather to prove claims that we're making anymore. In the conclusion, we are not going to be making any more claims. We're not going to be introducing any new concepts. The conclusion's job is to reinforce the analytical claim of the essay, which in this case is Gatsby's life, or rather death, represents the danger of living dishonestly, of living a superficial life that is false. So we want to answer the so what. Why does Fitzgerald want us to take that message away? Why does he think that's very important? So obviously in the conclusion, we would restate our thesis statement, this being our analytical claim. And we also want to answer that so what question. Why is this important? Why is learning from Fitzgerald and Gatsby the character so critical to our success in our daily lives? And so really here is where you kind of have the ability to preach a little bit from the soapbox by studying Gatsby's example and Fitzgerald's example. Really, Fitzgerald himself leads a very tragic life by its end. We can learn that our society doesn't do well when it focuses too much on materialism, when it focuses on the excesses of wealth. And instead, what we should be doing perhaps is living more honestly, living more in tune with who we really are and what our passions really are, and focusing on what we have as opposed to striving endlessly for these things that are just out of reach. So again, these feel kind of canned, but it's simply to demonstrate that at this point, our job is to convince the reader that by having read the essay, he or she should be more enlightened, that he or she should take away something from an analysis of Gatsby and of Fitzgerald's writing, and that we shouldn't just be scratching our heads wondering why we embarked on this endeavor, what we're supposed to have learned from this essay. Conclusion answers to so what. You as the writer, it is your responsibility to kind of come up with that insight. Why did you focus on telling this analysis? Why did you focus on writing about Fitzgerald, writing about Gatsby, Nick, etc.? What are we as the reader rather, supposed to take away from reading this essay? Okay, so to review what our steps were to put together this literary analysis, obviously we have to read the novel. We then need to start thinking about what evidence is available. We never want to come away with a claim before we review the evidence. So we read the text. We analyze the text using pre-writing strategies. So we want to look at what's available first. The pre-writing strategies that we used in this case were the iceberg method, as well as the who, what, where, when, how, and why questions. So we isolated the characters, the setting, the plot, and so forth. We looked at what happened. We thought about them within the context of one another. And from that, we were able to come away with certain possible themes. The one that we chose was that Gatsby's death is a cautionary tale, or an example of what might happen if one lives dishonestly, at least according to Fitzgerald and his unique life experiences. So once we've done that, we then arrive at a possible thesis. We do our research. So we look at primary and secondary sources. Primary in this case would obviously be the novel itself, The Great Gatsby, but we can also get evidence from writings from Fitzgerald, writings from his contemporaries, such as his friends, such as Ernest Hemingway, his wife, Zelda Fitzgerald, and so on. We can look at reviews at the time, historical documents that review and analyze Fitzgerald's writing. We can look at more contemporary analyses of Fitzgerald and his writing. These are things like we would get from databases, for example, or scholarly journals. And then once we have compiled all of those things, pertinent quotes from the primary novel, information from Fitzgerald's own diaries and essays, information from secondary analyses and reviews, we are ready to start organizing our essay. That's when we embark on the outline. So we divide our essay into its intro, body, and conclusion using the IBC formula. We establish what is most important to include in the intro. We establish what pieces of evidence we're going to use to support our analytical claim in the body. And finally, we discuss the so what. Why are we writing this essay? What is our reader meant to learn from it? And the conclusion. Once we've done all of that, we have all the ingredients necessary basically to draft, without too much fuss, the actual essay. So all of these, again, are tools and strategies that I would recommend strongly when embarking on a literary analysis. You don't necessarily have to do all of these different steps. Some of your essays may not require additional research. Sometimes additional research will be mandatory. Sometimes you will find that in order simply to write your essay well, even if the research is not mandatory, you have to look up sources. Outlining is very powerful, and I do recommend strongly that you use it on any type of essay, whatever the genre. And as far as the iceberg method and other pre-writing strategies are concerned, if they work for you, perfect. If they do not work for you, I encourage you to look for additional or alternative strategies that can help you sometimes parse a novel. Analysis is not easy. It tends to be very difficult, especially if you have not had much practice with it. And especially with a novel like The Great Gatsby, it can take some time and a lot of thinking, a lot of kind of critical thinking to sort of arrive at some insightful points about the book. With that being said, I hope that this provides some clarity as far as how to start a literary analysis essay of any given literary text. Again, these strategies are yours to play with and modify. This is what I would recommend as a starting point for trying to write a literary analysis.